7-year-old Emma Richardson sat quietly in her wheelchair at the edge of the crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace, her bright blue eyes fixed on the tall royal guard standing perfectly still at his post. Unlike the hundreds of other tourists taking photos and chattering excitedly about the changing of the guard ceremony, Emma remained silent. Her small hands folded in her lap as she studied the soldier's impressive red uniform and tall black hat. Emma had been born with a rare condition that affected her ability to walk and speak. But her mind was sharp, and her spirit was stronger than most people twice her age. She communicated through a combination of hand signals, facial expressions, and a special tablet that converted her thoughts into spoken words. Her parents, Sarah and David Richardson, had brought her to London from their small village in Yorkshire as a special treat for her 7th birthday. Knowing how much she loved stories about castles, kings, and brave soldiers. The royal guard at the palace gate was Lance Corporal James Mitchell, a 24-year-old soldier who had been serving in the prestigious Queen's Guard for 18 months. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, James was an imposing figure in his traditional scarlet tunic, with its gold braiding, white belt, and perfectly polished boots. His bearskin hat added several more inches to his height, making him appear almost giant-like to the children who often gathered to stare at him in wonder. James had been trained to maintain perfect stillness during his duty hours, ignoring all distractions from tourists who tried everything imaginable to make him smile, laugh, or break his ceremonial composure. Children would wave at him, adults would pose for photos beside him, and sometimes people would even try to touch his uniform or weapon. But James remained as motionless as a statue. His eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the crowd. Today felt different, though James couldn't quite explain why. Among the usual crowd of camera-wielding tourists and excited children, his peripheral vision had caught sight of a small girl in a wheelchair who wasn't behaving like the others. While everyone else was talking, laughing, and moving around constantly, this little girl sat perfectly still, simply watching him with an intensity that was both respectful and somehow deeply moving. Emma's parents had positioned her wheelchair where she could have a clear view of the guard while staying out of the way of other visitors. Sarah Richardson knelt beside her daughter's chair, quietly explaining the importance of the soldiers, Job, and the long tradition of the royal guards who protected the monarchy. Emma listened carefully, but her attention remained focused on the guard himself rather than her mother's words. That soldier has a very important job. Sweetheart, Saray whispered to Emma. He has to stand very still and watch for anything dangerous that might threaten the royal family. He can't talk or move around like we can because he's working to keep everyone safe. Emma nodded thoughtfully, her intelligent eyes continuing to study James's face. She could see beyond his formal exterior to something deeper, perhaps loneliness, or the weight of responsibility he carried, or simply the human being beneath the impressive uniform. Other visitors saw only the ceremonial display, but Emma seemed to recognize the person behind the pageantry. The morning sun was growing warmer, and James could feel sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform and tall hat. Standing perfectly still for hours at a time was more physically demanding than most people realized, requiring not just mental discipline but also significant physical endurance. His feet ached in his tight boots, and his shoulders burned from maintaining perfect posture while carrying his rifle. But his training kept him motionless and focused. Emma noticed something that the other tourists missed, tiny signs that the guard was struggling with the heat and the physical demands of his position. She saw the barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw, and the way his breathing had become just a little deeper. Her years of communicating without words had made her extraordinarily observant of nonverbal cues that others overlooked. David Richardson, Emma's father, was a retired teacher who had spent his career working with children with special needs. He had noticed his daughter's unusual focus on the royal guard and recognized the signs that Emma was processing something important. Over the years, he had learned to trust Emma's instincts about people and situations. Even when he didn't fully understand what she was thinking, she's really concentrating on that soldier, isn't she? David said quietly to his wife, I wonder what's going through her mind. You know how she gets when she's really thinking about something? Sarah nodded, familiar with her daughter's intense periods of observation and analysis. Emma had always been able to see things in people that others missed, perhaps because her own challenges had made her more sensitive to the struggles and emotions of those around her. It was as if her inability to communicate in conventional ways had sharpened her ability to understand. The unspoken language of human experience, the crowd around them, continued to grow as the time for the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Tourists jostled for better positions, cameras flashed constantly, and children called out to the motionless soldiers, trying unsuccessfully to get their attention. The noise and activity level increased dramatically, but Emma remained calm and focused, her attention never wavering from James. James was beginning to feel the effects of standing in the increasingly hot sun while wearing his heavy wool uniform. The weight of his bearskin hat seemed to increase with each passing minute, and he could feel moisture gathering under the thick fabric of his tunic. Maintaining his composure was becoming more challenging, but his pride in his position and his commitment to military discipline kept him perfectly still. What James didn't know was that Emma was developing a plan, something that would require courage, perfect timing, and a deep understanding of when rules needed to be broken in service of something more important than protocol. She had seen something in this soldier that touched her heart, and her young mind was working out how she might be able to help him in a way that no one would expect from a 7-year-old girl who couldn't speak. The stage was being set for a moment that would surprise everyone present and demonstrate that sometimes the most profound communications happen without words, between the most unlikely people, in ways that no training manual or protocol could possibly anticipate. As the morning progressed and the crowd around Buckingham Palace grew larger and more boisterous, Emma continued her quiet observation of Lance Corporal James Mitchell. While other children in the crowd grew restless and began asking their parents when something exciting would happen, Emma remained perfectly content to simply watch the motionless soldier, her intuitive mind picking up on subtle details that revealed his growing discomfort. The temperature had risen considerably since the early morning hours, and London was experiencing one of its hottest days of the summer. James could feel rivulets of sweat running down his back beneath the thick wool of his ceremonial tunic. His legs were beginning to ache from maintaining his rigid standing position for over 2 hours. The weight of his rifle, normally manageable, seemed to increase with each passing minute as his muscles grew tired. Emma noticed the almost imperceptible changes in James's posture and facial expression that indicated his physical distress. His jaw had tightened slightly, and there was a barely visible tremor in his left hand that suggested he was fighting against the natural, human urge to move and stretch his cramped muscles. Most people would never have detected these minute signs, but Emma's years of communicating through nonverbal cues had made her extraordinarily sensitive to the subtle language of human discomfort. Sarah Richardson had been watching her daughter's intense focus on the Royal Guard with growing curiosity. As a special education teacher herself, she recognized that Emma was processing something important, though she couldn't yet understand what had captured her daughter's attention so completely. Emma's ability to connect with people on an emotional level had always been remarkable, but this level of sustained concentration was unusual even for her. "Emma, sweetheart, would you like to move closer to see the other guards?" Sarah suggested gently, hoping to engage her daughter in the broader spectacle that was drawing excited reactions from the other children around them. "There are several soldiers in different positions, and the changing of the guard ceremony will begin soon." Emma shook her head firmly, her eyes never leaving James's face. She raised one small hand and pointed directly at him, then placed both hands over her heart in a gesture that her parents recognized as her way of indicating that something was very important to her. Her expression was serious and determined, conveying a message that was clearer than any words could have been. David Richardson knelt down beside his daughter's wheelchair, following her gaze toward the Royal Guard who had captured her attention. "What is it about this particular soldier that interests you so much, Emma? Can you help us understand what you're thinking?" Emma reached for her communication tablet, her small fingers moving quickly across the screen to select the words and symbols that would help her parents understand her observations. The device's electronic voice spoke for her, Soldier hot. Soldier tired. Soldier needs help, but cannot ask. The simple but profound observation struck both parents immediately. While everyone else in the crowd was focused on the pageantry and tradition of the royal guards, Emma had seen past the ceremony to recognize the human being underneath the impressive uniform. She had identified someone in distress who was prevented by duty and protocol from expressing his needs or seeking assistance. James, meanwhile, was fighting an increasingly difficult battle against the physical demands of his position. The combination of the heavy uniform, the blazing sun, the requirement to remain absolutely motionless was pushing him toward the limits of his endurance. He had been trained for exactly these conditions, but today's heat was exceptional. And he could feel his body beginning to protest against the continued strain. The crowd around Emma's family had grown to include tourists from dozens of countries, all eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony and to take photographs with the stoic soldiers. Children called out greetings in various languages, adults posed for selfies, and tour guides provided commentary about the history and significance of the royal guards. But none of them seemed to notice what Emma had observed about James's condition. Emma began working on her tablet again, this time taking much longer to compose her thoughts. Her parents waited patiently, having learned over the years that their daughter's most important communications often required time and careful consideration. When she was ready, the electronic voice spoke her message. "Want to help, soldier? No special way. Please trust Emma." Sarah and David exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that meant Emma had developed one of her intuitive plans for helping someone in need. Throughout her young life, Emma had demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify when people were struggling and to find creative ways to offer assistance. Despite her own physical limitations, her parents had learned to trust these instincts. Even when they didn't fully understand her methods. "What kind of help did you have in mind, sweetheart?" David asked gently, though he suspected that Emma's plan might involve some form of nonverbal communication that would transcend the formal protocols that prevented the royal guard from interacting with the public. Emma's response was to reach into the small bag attached to her wheelchair and pull out a bottle of water that her mother had packed for their day of sightseeing. She held it up and pointed toward James, then made a series of hand gestures that her parents had come to understand as her way of indicating that she wanted to give something to someone who needed it. The request presented a dilemma for Emma's parents. They knew that royal guards were not permitted to accept gifts or interact with tourists during their ceremonial duties, and they were concerned about potentially causing problems for the young soldier by attempting to break protocol. At the same time, they recognized that Emma's instincts about people in need were rarely wrong, and they could see for themselves that the guard was clearly struggling with the heat. "Emma, I'm not sure the soldier is allowed to accept gifts from visitors," Sarah explained carefully. "He has very strict rules about his job. We don't want to get him in trouble with his commanders." Emma shook her head emphatically and began working on her tablet again. This time her message was longer and more complex, revealing the depth of thought she had put into understanding the situation, not gift. "Help signal? Soldier will understand. Emma knows secret language. Please let Emma try." The mention of a secret language intrigued both parents. Emma had always been remarkably perceptive about nonverbal communication, and she had developed her own system of gestures and signals that often seemed to transcend conventional methods of interaction. If she believed she could communicate with the royal guard in a way that wouldn't violate his duties, perhaps there was something they didn't yet understand about her plan. James, unaware of the intense discussion taking place nearby, continued his struggle against the mounting physical discomfort of his position. His vision was beginning to blur slightly from the heat, and he could feel his body's temperature rising to dangerous levels. He knew that he needed to maintain his post until the changing of the guard ceremony, but he was beginning to worry about his ability to remain conscious and upright for much longer. The stage was set for Emma to attempt something that would surprise everyone. Present and demonstrate that sometimes the most important communications happen through understanding and compassion rather than words or formal protocols. Emma's determination to help the struggling royal guard had reached a critical point. She could see that James was fighting against increasing physical distress, and her young heart was filled with the kind of compassion that recognizes no barriers of age, protocol, or social convention. After another few minutes of careful observation, she began to implement a plan that would demonstrate the power of human connection in its purest form. First, Emma positioned her wheelchair so that she was directly in James's line of sight. Though still maintaining a respectful distance from his ceremonial post, she knew that royal guards were trained to keep their eyes fixed on a distant point. But she also understood that peripheral vision would allow him to see her movements without requiring him to break his formal posture or compromise his duties. Sarah and David Richardson watched their daughter with growing amazement as she began a series of deliberate, slow movements that seemed to follow some internal logic they didn't yet comprehend. Emma's actions were purposeful and measured, clearly part of a communication system that she had developed through her years of expressing herself without conventional speech. Emma raised her right hand slowly, palm facing James, and held it steady for exactly 10 seconds. This wasn't a casual wave like other children in the crowd were attempting, but rather a formal gesture that conveyed respect and recognition. She then placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the soldier not as a tourist attraction, but as a fellow human being deserving of dignity and appreciation. James's peripheral vision caught these movements, and something about their deliberate nature and respectful tone penetrated his formal composure in a way that the random gestures and shouts of other visitors had not. There was a quality to this little girl's actions that spoke of understanding rather than mere curiosity. And despite his training, he found his attention drawn to her quiet presence at the edge of the crowd. Next, Emma performed a gesture that her parents had never seen before, but that seemed to come from some deep well of intuitive knowledge about human communication. She cupped her hands together as if holding water, then slowly raised them toward her lips in the universal gesture for drinking, all while maintaining eye contact with James through his peripheral vision. The message was clear and unmistakable. She recognized that he was thirsty and overheated, and she was offering acknowledgement of his need in a way that didn't require him to break protocol or compromise his position. It was a moment of pure human connection that transcended the formal barriers between a ceremonial guard and a young visitor. James felt something shift inside his chest as he processed what the little girl was communicating to him. In all his months of standing guard at various royal locations, no visitor had ever shown such perceptive awareness of his human needs or offered such respectful acknowledgement of his situation. The gesture touched something deep in his heart that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with basic human kindness. Emma wasn't finished with her communication. She reached into her bag and withdrew the bottle of water her mother had packed, holding it up so that James could see it clearly. But instead of attempting to approach him or break the protocols that governed his duties, she did something that stunned everyone who was paying attention to her actions. She opened the bottle and took a long, deliberate drink herself, then held the bottle against her cheek to demonstrate its coolness. Her message was sophisticated and beautiful in its simplicity. She was sharing the experience of refreshment with him, allowing him to feel less alone in his discomfort by showing that someone understood and cared about his situation. A small crowd that had gathered around Emma and her family began to notice her unusual interaction with the royal guard, unlike the typical tourist behavior of trying to make the guards laugh or break character. This little girl seemed to be engaged in some form of respectful dialogue that acknowledged the soldier's humanity while honoring his professional duties. "Look at what that little girl is doing," whispered an elderly woman to her companion. "She's not trying to make the guard laugh or get his attention for a photo. She's actually communicating with him somehow." James found himself deeply moved by Emma's compassionate approach. Her actions demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and empathy that many adults never achieved, and her intuitive understanding of how to offer comfort without compromising his position revealed a wisdom far beyond her years. For the first time in his career as a royal guard, he felt truly seen and acknowledged as a human being rather than just a ceremonial display. Emma's final gesture was the most powerful of all. She placed her small hand over her heart, and extended that same hand toward James in a gesture that conveyed solidarity and support. Her message was clear. I see you. I understand what you're going through, and you're not alone. The emotional impact of this simple communication was immediate and profound. James felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, though his military training prevented them from falling. The little girl's recognition of his struggle and her offer of emotional support had touched him more deeply than any commendation or recognition he had ever received from his superior officers. Emma's parents were witnessing something extraordinary. Their daughter, who faced her own daily challenges with communication and mobility, had somehow found a way to connect with and comfort a complete stranger who was bound by rigid protocols that prevented normal social interaction. Her natural empathy and intuitive understanding of human nature had created a moment of genuine connection that transcended all the usual barriers between people. The other tourists in the immediate area had begun to notice Emma's unusual behavior and the subtle but unmistakable response it was generating from the Royal Guard, while James maintained his formal posture and proper positioning. There was something different about his presence now, a sense that he had been emotionally touched by the little girl's compassionate outreach. What happened next would surprise everyone present and demonstrate that sometimes the most rigid protocols must yield to the more fundamental human need for connection, understanding, and mutual support. Emma's secret language of the heart was about to inspire a response that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. James knew that what he was about to do would violate every rule of conduct he had been taught during his training as a Royal Guard. But in that moment, faced with such pure and innocent compassion from a child who asked for nothing in return, he realized that some things were more important than protocol. The little girl's gift of recognition and empathy deserved acknowledgement. Regardless of the potential consequences to his military career, the moment that would change everything happened so quickly that many in the crowd almost missed it. James Mitchell, Lance Corporal in Her Majesty's Royal Guard, made a decision that went against every rule, regulation, and protocol he had been taught during his military training. Moved by Emma's extraordinary display of empathy and human connection, he did something that Royal Guards simply do not do while on ceremonial duty. James slowly turned his head toward Emma, abandoning his required focus on the distant horizon, and looked directly into her bright blue eyes. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the rigid requirements of Royal Guard duty. For a Royal Guard to break his ceremonial pose and acknowledge a member of the public during formal duties was unprecedented, and could potentially result in serious disciplinary action. But James's response didn't stop there. With deliberate, careful movements that maintained his dignity while acknowledging Emma's compassionate gesture, he shifted his weight slightly and nodded once, a clear, unmistakable acknowledgement of her kindness and recognition of their shared human connection. The nod lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but its impact was immediate and profound. The small group of tourists who had been watching Emma's interaction with the guard gasped audibly when they realized what they were witnessing. Children pointed excitedly, adults whispered to each other in amazement, and several people began reaching for their cameras to capture this extraordinary moment of human connection that was unfolding before them. Emma's face lit up with pure joy when she saw James's response to her communication. Her smile was radiant and triumphant, not because she had succeeded in making the guard break protocol, but because she had achieved something far more important. She had reached across the barriers of duty, formality, and social convention to touch another human being's heart and receive acknowledgement in return. Sarah Richardson felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter's moment of connection with the Royal Guard. As a mother who had spent years watching Emma struggle to communicate with a world that didn't always understand her unique language, seeing her daughter successfully reach out to comfort someone else was overwhelmingly beautiful and moving. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered to her husband, her voice thick with emotion. He actually acknowledged her. He broke his ceremonial position to respond to our little girl's kindness. David Richardson was equally moved by what they had witnessed. As an educator who had worked with special needs children throughout his career, he understood the significance of what Emma had accomplished. She had not only communicated effectively with someone under extremely challenging circumstances, but she had also demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence and compassion that could inspire others to set aside rigid rules in favor of fundamental human decency. James knew that his actions would likely be observed by his superior officers, either directly or through the security cameras that monitored the palace grounds continuously. Royal guards were expected to maintain perfect discipline at all times, and any deviation from protocol was typically met with serious consequences. But in that moment, faced with such pure and innocent compassion, the potential disciplinary action seemed far less important than honoring the little girl's extraordinary gesture. The crowd around Emma had grown larger as word spread through the gathered tourists that something unusual was happening between the little girl in the wheelchair and the royal guard. People from various parts of the palace grounds began moving closer to witness what was clearly an extraordinary moment of human connection. Emma, emboldened by James's acknowledgement of her communication, decided to complete her message of support and encouragement. She reached into her bag once more and withdrew a small British flag that her parents had purchased as a souvenir of their trip to London. With slow, deliberate movements that conveyed respect and admiration, she held the flag against her heart and then extended it toward James in a gesture of gratitude for his service. The symbolism was beautiful and unmistakable. Emma was honoring not just James as an individual, but also his role as a protector of the traditions and values that the flag represented. Her gesture acknowledged the sacrifice and dedication required of those who serve their country. While also recognizing the human cost of such service, James felt his composure beginning to crack as he watched this remarkable little girl honor him in his service in such a thoughtful and meaningful way. Throughout his military career, he had received various forms of recognition and appreciation, but nothing had ever touched him as deeply as this spontaneous tribute from a 7-year-old child who understood sacrifice and dedication despite her young age and personal challenges. Unable to maintain his ceremonial stillness any longer in the face of such moving tribute, James made another decision that would astound everyone present. He slowly raised his right hand to his temple in a formal military salute directed specifically at Emma, a gesture of respect and recognition that acknowledged her as someone worthy of the highest military honor. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause and cheers as they witnessed this unprecedented display of mutual respect and human connection. Cameras flashed constantly as tourists captured images of the royal guard saluting the little girl in the wheelchair, while others simply stood in amazement at the beauty of what they were witnessing. Emma's response to James's salute was immediate and perfect. Despite her physical limitations, she straightened in her wheelchair as much as she was able and raised her small hand to her forehead, in her own version of a military salute, returning James's honor with equal dignity and respect. Her salute was imperfect by military standards, but perfect in its sincerity and emotional power. The exchange between Emma and James had created a moment of pure human connection that transcended all the usual barriers between people: age, rank, physical ability, and social convention had all dissolved in the face of genuine compassion, mutual respect, and the recognition of shared humanity. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone present why human beings are capable of such extraordinary beauty and grace. James knew that he would likely face questions and possibly disciplinary action for his breach of protocol, but he also knew that he had done the right thing. Some moments in life are more important than rules and regulations, and this little girl had created one of those moments through her remarkable empathy and courage. The crowd continued to applaud and cheer as Emma and James maintained their mutual salute for several seconds, creating a tableau that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. It was a moment that demonstrated the power of compassion to bridge any gap and the importance of recognizing and honoring the humanity in others. Regardless of circumstances or conventions, what neither Emma nor James realized was that their extraordinary exchange had been witnessed by someone whose opinion would determine whether James faced consequences for his actions or received recognition for his humanity and wisdom in responding to such an exceptional moment of human connection. Among the crowd of tourists and onlookers who had witnessed the extraordinary exchange between Emma and James was someone whose presence would make all the difference in determining the consequences of the Royal Guard's breach of protocol. Colonel Patricia Whitmore, commanding officer of the Queen's Guard Regiment, had been conducting her routine inspection of the palace security arrangements when she noticed the unusual commotion near James's post. Colonel Whitmore was a career military officer with 32 years of service, known throughout the armed forces for her strict adherence to discipline and protocol. She had earned her position through unwavering dedication to military standards and had never been known to tolerate deviations from established procedures. Her reputation for maintaining the highest standards of conduct among the Royal Guards was legendary, and junior officers typically approached interactions with her with considerable anxiety. However, Colonel Whitmore was also a mother of 3 and a grandmother of 2, which gave her a perspective on human nature that extended beyond military regulations. As she observed the interaction between the little girl in the wheelchair and Lance Corporal Mitchell, she found herself witnessing something that challenged her understanding of when rules should be absolute and when they should yield to higher principles. From her vantage point approximately 50 meters away, Colonel Whitmore had watched Emma's entire sequence of communication with James. She had seen the little girl's respectful acknowledgement of the soldier's discomfort, her compassionate gesture of sharing refreshment, and her beautiful tribute with the British flag. Most importantly, she had observed the profound impact that Emma's empathy had on James, on everyone else who witnessed their exchange. As a military commander, Colonel Whitmore's first instinct was to be concerned about the breach of protocol that James had committed by acknowledging a member of the public and breaking his ceremonial pose. Royal Guards were expected to maintain absolute discipline regardless of circumstances, and any deviation from established procedures could potentially compromise security or set dangerous precedents for future conduct. But as a human being and a mother, Colonel Whitmore recognized that she had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment of pure compassion that had inspired genuine human connection between two people who would normally never interact. The little girl's actions had demonstrated the kind of wisdom and empathy that many adults never achieved, while James's response had shown the courage to choose humanity over rigid adherence to rules when faced with exceptional circumstances. Colonel Whitmore moved closer to the scene, observing the continued interaction between Emma and James, as well as the crowd's reaction to what they were witnessing. She could see that the other tourists were deeply moved by the exchange, with many people wiping away tears as they watched the mutual salute between the little girl and the soldier. The crowd had grown to include several hundred people, all drawn by word of the extraordinary moment unfolding at the palace gates. Social media posts were already beginning to spread images and videos of Emma and James's interaction, with captions describing it as one of the most beautiful displays of human compassion anyone had ever witnessed at a royal location. Emma's parents approached Colonel Whitmore, recognizing her military rank and hoping to explain their daughter's actions before any official complaints were filed against the young guard who had shown such kindness to their child. "Excuse me?" Colonel David Richardson said respectfully, his voice filled with both pride in his daughter and concern for the soldier who had responded to her. "I'm Emma's father, and I wanted you to know that our daughter never intended to cause any problems for your soldier. She was just trying to help someone she could see was struggling with the heat," Sarah Richardson added. "Emma has special needs, and she's always been able to sense when people are in distress. She wasn't trying to make him break rules. She was just using her own way of showing compassion and support." Colonel Whitmore listened carefully to Emma's parents, studying their faces and recognizing the genuine concern they felt for James's welfare. Despite their obvious pride in their daughter's actions, she then looked at Emma herself, seeing the intelligent, an empathetic child who had created this extraordinary moment through her natural instinct to help others. "What your daughter did today was remarkable," Colonel Whitmore said to Emma's parents, her voice carrying warmth that surprised them, given her stern military appearance. "I've been in the military for over 3 decades, and I've rarely seen such pure compassion and wisdom from anyone, let alone someone so young." Emma, who had been watching this conversation intently, used her communication tablet to join the discussion. Her electronic voice spoke clearly. Soldier was hurting. Emma wanted to help. Did Emma cause trouble for Soldier? The question pierced Colonel Whitmore's heart with its innocent concern for James's welfare. This little girl, who had shown such extraordinary empathy and courage, was now worried that her act of kindness might have caused problems for the person she had tried to help. It was a level of selfless consideration that Colonel Whitmore found both humbling and inspiring. "No, Emma, you didn't cause trouble," Colonel Whitmore replied, kneeling down to speak with the little girl at eye level. "What you did was show kindness to someone who needed it, and that's never wrong. Lance Corporal Mitchell responded to your kindness because he recognized something very special in what you were doing." James, who had returned to his ceremonial position, but was obviously listening to the conversation taking place nearby, felt a mixture of relief and continued concern about the consequences of his actions. He had no regrets about acknowledging Emma's compassion, but he also understood that military discipline was essential to maintaining the standards expected of the Royal Guard. Colonel Whitmore stood and walked over to James's position, studying the young soldier who had made such a difficult choice between following protocol and responding to genuine human need. She could see that he was still struggling with the heat, and she also recognized the emotional impact that Emma's kindness had on him. "Lance Corporal Mitchell," Colonel Whitmore said in her official command voice, causing James to stand even straighter despite his physical discomfort. "I observed your interaction with the young visitor. Do you have anything to say about your decision to break ceremonial protocol?" James knew that his military career might depend on his response to this question. He could apologize, claim temporary loss of judgment due to heat exhaustion, or try to minimize what had happened. Instead, he chose to tell the simple truth about why he had acted as he did. "Colonel Drew, that little girl showed me more genuine kindness and understanding than I've ever experienced from a stranger," James replied, his voice steady and sincere. "Her compassion was so pure, and her recognition of my situation was so respectful, that I felt compelled to acknowledge her humanity in return. I accept full responsibility for breaking protocol, and I stand ready to accept whatever consequences are deemed appropriate." Colonel Whitmore studied James's face, seeing not defiance or disrespect, but rather the kind of moral courage that she had spent her career trying to instill in the soldiers under her command. Here was a young man who had chosen to risk his career to honor an act of pure compassion from a child, and who was willing to face consequences for putting human decency above rigid adherence to rules. The decision that Colonel Whitmore was about to make would surprise everyone present and demonstrate that true military leadership sometimes requires the wisdom to recognize when breaking rules serves a higher purpose than following them blindly. Colonel Whitmore stood in silence for a long moment, her experienced military mind weighing the competing demands of discipline and humanity that James's actions had brought into sharp focus. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that they were about to witness a decision that would determine not only the young soldier's fate, but also send a message about what truly mattered in service to others. "Lance Corporal Mitchell," Colonel Whitmore began, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military leadership. "In 32 years of service, I have seen soldiers face enemy fire, endure extreme hardships, and make tremendous sacrifices for their country. But what I witnessed here today represents something equally valuable: the moral courage to choose compassion over convention when faced with genuine human need." James remained at attention, though Emma could see the slight relaxation in his shoulders that suggested relief beginning to flow through his rigid posture. The crowd leaned forward, straining to hear every word of what was clearly a pivotal moment. "The protocols that govern the Royal Guard exist to maintain dignity, security, and tradition," Colonel Whitmore continued, now speaking loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear her words. But those protocols serve a higher purpose. They exist to protect and honor the values that make our society worth defending. Today, a remarkable young lady reminded us all of what those values truly are. Colonel Whitmore turned toward Emma, her stern military bearing softening as she addressed the little girl who had started this extraordinary chain of events. Emma, what you did today demonstrated the very qualities that our soldiers are sworn to protect: compassion, courage, and the recognition that every human being deserves dignity and care. You saw someone in need and found a way to help. Even though it wasn't easy, and even though you asked for nothing in return, Emma's tablet spoke for her. Thank you. Emma just wanted Soldier to know he wasn't alone. The simple statement brought tears to Colonel Whitmore's eyes, though she maintained her composure with the discipline of a career officer. This 7-year-old child had articulated something profound about human connection and the responsibility we all share to care for one another, especially those who serve others. Lance Corporal Mitchell, Colonel Whitmore said, returning her attention to James. Your decision to acknowledge this young lady's kindness was not a failure of discipline. It was an act of moral leadership. You recognized something exceptional and responded with the humanity that makes you not just a good soldier, but a good man. The crowd began to murmur excitedly. They realized that James was not going to face punishment for his actions. Instead, it appeared that his commanding officer was actually commending him for the very behavior that had seemed to violate military protocol. Therefore, Colonel Whitmore announced, in a voice that carried across the entire gathering rather than disciplinary action, I am recommending Lance Corporal Mitchell for a commendation recognizing his demonstration of the values that the Royal Guard exists to protect. His actions today brought honor to his uniform and to the institution he serves. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause and cheers, with many people wiping away tears as they celebrated this unexpected conclusion to an already extraordinary day. Emma clapped her hands together with pure joy, her face glowing with happiness that her new friend would not face consequences for showing her kindness. But Colonel Whitmore wasn't finished. She approached Emma's wheelchair and knelt beside it, speaking directly to the little girl who had taught everyone present a lesson about the power of compassion to transform even the most rigid circumstances. Emma, I would like to make you an honorary member of the Queen's Guard, Colonel Whitmore said, producing a small ceremonial pin from her uniform. This recognizes your service to others through kindness, your courage in reaching out to help someone in need, and your demonstration of the values that every soldier should strive to embody. Emma's parents watched in amazement as the stern military commander pinned the honorary badge to their daughter's shirt, officially recognizing her as someone who had served with distinction despite never wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon. It was a moment that acknowledged that true service comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful acts of valor happen through simple human kindness. James, still maintaining his post, but now with official permission to interact with Emma, stepped forward and offered her another salute, this time not as a breach of protocol, but as one service member honoring another. Emma returned the salute with perfect dignity, her small hand steady at her forehead as she acknowledged the bond that had formed between them. The changing of the guard. Ceremony will proceed as scheduled, Colonel Whitmore announced to the crowd. But today's events will be remembered as an example of what happens when protocol serves its true purpose, protecting and honoring the humanity in all of us. As the formal ceremony began and James prepared to be relieved of his duty, he caught Emma's eye one final time. The little girl who couldn't speak with words had taught him more about communication, courage, and compassion than all his military training combined. She had shown him that true strength sometimes meant being vulnerable enough to acknowledge connection with others. Even when rules suggested otherwise, Emma's family prepared to leave, their London vacation now containing a memory that would last forever. As they moved away from the crowd, Emma used her tablet to send one final message that her parents read aloud to James. Thank you for letting Emma help. Good soldiers take care of each other. Emma will remember brave soldier friend always. The words carried across the crowd, reaching James just as his replacement arrived to take over the ceremonial post. For the first time in 18 months of service as a royal guard, he completed his duty shift with tears of joy in his eyes, knowing that he had been part of something that transcended protocol and touched the very heart of what it means to serve others. As Emma's family disappeared into the crowd of tourists, continuing their London adventures. The story of their encounter with Lance Corporal James Mitchell began spreading far beyond the palace gates. Within hours, images and videos of their interaction were being shared around the world, inspiring millions of people with the reminder that compassion knows no boundaries, and that sometimes the most important rules are the ones written on the human heart. The Royal Guard returned to his ceremonial duties, but both Emma and James carried forward the knowledge that they had been part of something beautiful and transformative, a moment when two people from very different worlds found a way to connect, support each other, and demonstrate that kindness truly is the most powerful force for change in the world.